From the studios in beautiful Oceanport, New Jersey, welcome to the biggest and greatest podcast ever. I'm your host, Ray Kay. Hey, everybody. This is another exciting interview I have coming up here. This is a prolific writer, 11 books to his name. The latest one, actually, is celebrating a 51st anniversary come June 6th. The book's been out, a few weeks since it's June 21st. But this is a tremendous read on RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, the one and only, who died tragically, as we all know, 51 years ago. The book's called Dreams That Never Were. I always wonder what would have happened if RFK lived. I mean, it's just a natural type of, wonder, But this is something. I'm so glad that Greg is coming out here. Greg Messel's my guest. Greg, did I pronounce that correctly, Messel?
Yes.
Okay. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Well, thanks for coming out. I mean, I'm very excited all day, to interview you. Well, let's get into it as far as like the events that led up to you writing this book. Tell me.
Well, it's one that the death of RFK has always been really part of my political DNA, I guess, or something. I'm very interested in politics and history, and I was really, I say in kind of a foreword of the book that I was a senior in high school when this happened, and I was getting very excited about politics. And I had been to some mock political conventions and things like that. And I was very excited about RFK because he seemed to stand for the things that I thought were important. And so when he was suddenly killed, it was, and that's one of the themes I kind of talk about in the book, that it's a real hit to people's idealism, which I was idealistic at the time, and also to your hope that things could really be better.
Now, leading up to that, I was 8 when it happened. I remember it, because I know Martin Luther King, earlier, and it was like, when you're 8, it's kind of a crazy time. But you're a senior in high school, more cognizant of life, than the younger people. What was the feeling dangerous? I mean, you hear the summer of '68. It seemed like a really dangerous type time. Was that in the air at all before that happened?
Oh, absolutely. And you would, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my friends and I went over to Berkeley a lot. And you have to be not very smart to do that in some cases. We would go over when there was rioting, and we just, anti-war protests and.
So that was real. I mean, that was really going on. I mean, through your personal experience. Okay.
And then I think there was a feeling in the air that when Robert Kennedy said he was going to run for president, even though he was very popular, there were a lot of people who said, "Oh no." They just kind of had a bad feeling about this, that something might happen to him. And when you watch I've watched a lot of video that's available of his campaign through Oregon and California just before he died, to kind of refresh my memory. And it's scary to watch that, because he wasn't riding in an open car like JFK was and waving to the crowd. This was like a riot. He was standing on the hood of a car or the trunk of a car, and his bodyguards had their arms wrapped around him trying to hold him in the car, and he was being mobbed. And you look at that and think, wow, that is so incredibly dangerous. And I remember one thing specifically in San Francisco, that this was just a few days before his death, but he was doing a motorcade through Chinatown, in San Francisco, and someone threw a string of firecrackers at his car. And the last thing anybody wanted to hear around anywhere near Robert Kennedy was a bunch of pops,
Right.
you know, and it really unnerved everyone. And I've read some accounts of that since that bear that out.
Now, an obvious question just coming to my mind. All right, the Kennedys, high-profile family, a lot of tragedy in the family. The whole JFK thing, getting assassinated. You would think that he might have, took more precaution. I know it's the quarterback, after the fact and stuff, but was he just an ideal guy to hey, I'm here for the people. I'm not going to, use all this protection. Do you know what was going on in his mind not to have that kind of protection?
Well, there were a lot of people around him who were really nervous about that, and that they wanted him to be more cautious. But I've read this account probably 2 or 3 or 4 different sources where he had just got back from doing one of these motorcade rallies, and his shirt was torn and his hands are scratched up, and from the crowds, and his aides were saying, hey, this is not good. And he said to them, these are my people, and I want to be with them.
Okay. That's kind of what I would think. Did he, I don't know, was he leading the primaries? Was he the lead candidate? I know that's sort of a naive question, but was he the top guy, that was going to get the Democratic nomination?
Well, he at that point, there was a lot of dynamics, and he at first didn't want to run in 1968 because he didn't want to go head-to-head with LBJ. And then in March of that year, that's when LBJ said, I'm not going to run again. And, of course, the Vietnam War was in a terrible stage at that point.
What was your feelings at the time, Greg, as far as Vietnam? Were you, I guess you're going to come into draft age. Was there a big fear factor, from the street?
Oh, yes. Okay. Absolutely. And there was a lot of, there were guys who were just a little older than me that I had played baseball and basketball with, who I knew in school, and they were going to Vietnam, and some of them weren't coming back. And I knew people who had gotten into college, and then they got yanked out of college and sent to Vietnam. And one of the statistics I found that was just startling is that a majority of those killed in Vietnam were 18 and 19 years old. And there was even a statistic, there was almost 1,000 young men killed on their first day in Vietnam. And that tells you that these are young people who are kind of getting shoved out there, and after some training, and it's very scary place. And so there was definitely a fear factor. And then there was also the dynamic then that people under 21 couldn't vote.
Okay.
So there was always the feeling, and said among my generation, I'm old enough to die, but not old enough to vote.
Right.
And I went to the Kennedy Library recently, and there were some artifacts there from RFK and JFK's campaigns, and one of them, and I bought this button that said, if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. And that was one of the dynamics and one of the issues at the time that was pretty tough to take.
Yeah. Like, I'm going to fight this war, but I can't vote. It just doesn't, there's a disconnect,
Yes.
Now, in the book, I find this fascinating also. There was another person that was shot, Alex Hurley. That was his name, correct?
Hurley. Right.
Hurley. Okay.
Hurley. Yeah. It was Alex Hurley. He's the fictional character that you kind of see all these events through his eyes.
Okay, now he's a fictional. Was there anyone else that was really shot, or was it just
yes,
Robert?
in reality, and that was sort of what the genesis of my thought for this book. When Robert Kennedy was shot, there were 5 other people who were shot.
Oh, okay.
So in that pantry, when Sirhan started firing the gun, there were 5 others wounded. One of them was Paul Schrade, who was head of the United Auto Workers, and he actually got a bullet that in the top of his head, and he was very lucky he survived. And there were others, but I just thought a way to maybe tell this story. What if you had a character like Alex, and they were one of the ones who was wounded with Robert Kennedy, and what would that do to, what does that do to them? Mm-hmm. How do they cope with that?
Right, because they survive. I mean, they're there with them.
Yeah, everybody survived except Robert Kennedy, and there are people, including Paul Schrade and including Robert Kennedy Jr., who recently visited with Sirhan, who thinks there's more to the story about who was firing the guns, but that remains to be seen.
Did you speak with any of those Kennedys? Or
no, I haven't, but I have watched. I watched an interview with Paul Schrade, and he's very adamant that he thinks there was a second gunman, and then Robert Kennedy Jr. thinks there was. Sirhan did not shoot his father. Sirhan was very definitely firing the gun, though. And so there are some questions about the official version of this.
Did Sirhan admit to it, or what happened? With that.
Well, he's been kind of hazy over the years, as he spent a lot of years saying, "I don't even remember this happening," mm-hmm. and then of course that spins into all kinds. People start talking about the Manchurian Candidate, and he was hypnotized, and I mean, they're kind of going crazy with that, and. But then I've never really heard or read where he said, yeah, I did it.
Why would there be this, I know there's always these conspiracy theories, obviously with JFK, there's a huge one, I guess it may not be as huge in this one, but it sounds like there's something there. Like why in this case, wouldn't they, was it because they don't know who the other party was, or they're trying to cover up if there's another party? Like, what would the reason be that we don't know? For sure.
Yeah, well, they and I mentioned this in the book that the Los Angeles Police Department wanted to really keep a lid on the assassination and not turn it into a big conspiracy thing like had happened at Dallas. And so there's some who say they were pretty overly aggressive about squashing any ideas about a conspiracy. I have a chapter in the book that comes from Alex Hurley's girlfriend's father, who becomes his father-in-law, who talks about he's a history professor, and he talks about the assassinations and over the years, like going back to Archduke Ferdinand, the start of World War I, and all William McKinley and all these things. And so I think there is an element to these assassinations which it's really hard for us to take that randomly one person can step up and kill one of our leaders, and then the ripple effect of that is monumental, and it's just a random person who wanted attention or who's crazy or who is whatever. And that randomness, I think, is very difficult for us to deal with.
Yes, yeah. The Alex Hurley character, is that like your alter ego, Greg?
It kind of, he says what I was thinking, I guess, and what I was thinking at the time. And when people ask me if I'm Alex Hurley, I'll say, well, he's very handsome and women really like him, and he's really smart. So, obviously there's a comparison.
Oh, okay.
But that's not true, of course.
I wish I was modest. Alex You're very Hurley. Modest. Yeah.
But I think I had, I had him express my thoughts about all of this, and he did the same thing of going through what I went through, and that was a real loss of hope, and your idealism really is crushed. And I mean, so here's Robert Kennedy, who there's no doubt that there was a lot of star power there, which attracted people to him. Mm-hmm. But I was also attracted to the ideology of his. And then he dies, and suddenly you have Hubert Humphrey running against Richard Nixon. And, Hubert Humphrey looks like the guy who does your dad's taxes or something. I mean,
like a cheap accountant look or something.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
He's hardly an inspiring figure. And then, so you could make the argument that because of what Sirhan did, then Richard Nixon becomes the president. The war is prolonged several years, and then all of the things that came along with the Nixon presidency happened. And so that's why many times they talk about 1968 as a real year that CNN had a thing that said 1968, the year that changed America. And in many ways, that's true. So
in the reality, RFK gets shot. Is your immediate reaction, Greg, that there's the hope, there's the idealism gone? I mean, was that the immediate feeling?
Yeah, it was. So now where do we go? And I think there were a lot of I've seen interviews with people who were Kennedy volunteers, and they were idealistic college students, and there's all this political activism going on around them. And then when Robert Kennedy dies a couple of days after being shot, they're saying, where do we go? Where is there to go? And I think one of the things that was really telling about who Robert Kennedy appealed to was when the funeral train that went from New York to Washington for his burial in Arlington. I don't think there's ever really been an event like that where people spontaneously lined the tracks. And it was black people and brown people and white people and veterans and Boy Scouts and Little League baseball players, and they're all holding the flag, and you see young black teenagers standing out there in the sweltering heat with signs that say "So long, Bobby," and there was that outpouring was extraordinary.
I mean, it's a real feeling. I mean, you could think about it and you could kind of tear up. I mean, I get the power of that feeling by you just describing that whole thing. Like you're losing a family member. You lose.
Yeah, it really was. And when I look back on it now, I mean, I was 17 or 18 when all this happened, and so everyone seems older to you when you're 17 or 18. But it's now when I look back on it historically, it's remarkable to think that Bobby Kennedy was only 42 years old when he died, and Martin Luther King was only 39.
Right, right.
And
now,
wow.
now that's back then it seemed kind of older, but now I guess I don't know because when you age, it just seems so much younger.
Yes, yes, it does.
The one very interesting thing I found, Greg, is that when you spoke of this happening, is that we still haven't recovered. I mean, to me, that's quite a statement. I mean, and that's 51 years. Can you explain? That for all that time to go by and not recover at all. Can you explain how come we haven't recovered? Was he that strong of a figure, of a positive force in the world? I mean, that's 51 years of not recovering.
Yeah, I think I do like everybody else does when something terrible happens. You say, well, I move on because what choice do I have? And but you just it is kind of like you said at the top of the show. It is hard to not really think about what might have been. Now, I'm not foolish enough to think that all problems would have gone away if Robert Kennedy had become the president. But I do think that there would have been a softer approach. I think the war would have ended sooner than it did with LBJ or Nixon, and I think there would have been more compassionate for poor people, black people. Because at that time things were very, very tough for them, and I just that quote that I based the title of the book on about dreams that never were. There's an idealism to that quote, which is very touching, I think, and. When you think that why couldn't things be different? What if we did have a world where we weren't at war and where black people and white people and brown people and everyone lived in harmony? This idea that some men see things as they are and say why, and I dream of things that never were and say why not. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the examples of what he could do is if you remember, on the night Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was in Indianapolis running for the Indiana primary, and he wanted to go to the black neighborhood in Indianapolis to talk to them and tell them what happened to Martin Luther King. And all his security and the police are like, oh, whoa, no way. Are you crazy? We can't do that. And he wanted to go, and he went, and you can see the tape of that famous speech where he said, he announced to this big crowd of that Martin Luther King was shot and killed.
Right.
And then, but Indianapolis, and Indianapolis was one of the only places that did not have rioting in the city, and it was maybe that's a taste of something that could have happened had there been a different approach.
Do you see any hope, maybe in the next 10 years? Or is there any hope at all? Or, I know hope was sort of lost then, and then maybe all the way through. Is there any hope to get back to that thing? Was he that unique that it's going to be a heck of a long time before we kind of see that again in today's world?
I think it's really hard in today's world because people have become so jaded, and also people seem very that they're not open to new ideas or a new idea to them. You often hear that politically anytime anything bad happens, everybody retreats to their corner with their tribe, and and they think that the other people, whether it's conservative or liberal or going the other way, thinks the other group is bad. And I think it's hard to penetrate that division right now. And I also don't see any. And maybe it's because I was young and idealistic, but I certainly don't see any politician which kind of inspires me like Robert Kennedy did.
Do you hope that, I guess you need hope in life that maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe in 75 years, this stuff will filter out, and then you get this new guy that comes in, that whichever party he's from,
exactly. And I think it certainly is possible.
Okay, that's good to hear.
And I hope it does happen.
Right. The and you think in the year 2019. I remember in 1999. The year 2000s. You always think that the society gets better. Not fall back. So that always intrigues me. That even in 2019, it's like this. It kind of boggles my mind a little bit.
Yeah, and in a way, you can see whether it's the Middle East or whatever. It seems that we keep making the same kinds of mistakes. And one of the things I did before, as I was starting this book, is I went to Arlington, and I went to that place is just. That cemetery is mind-boggling to go there, very emotional to go there. Mm-hmm. And I went to Robert Kennedy's grave, among others. And but you just look over those hillsides and kind of count the cost of what has been paid in our wars, and in some cases defending freedom, and in some cases you think, I'm not sure why they died, mm-hmm. but I sure think that going to Arlington would make you very cautiously proceed before sending people into harm's way.
So everybody should really go there. I have been there. Yeah. I mean, maybe once or twice, but it was very, very powerful, and it makes you, makes you think. What would have happened if there was no Vietnam War? I mean, I know it's totally hypothetical, of course, but I mean, is there any? Well, what would it be like? I'm just talking fun now. Just talking.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of evidence to show that. There was the excellent Ken Burns series on Vietnam,
right.
And then also in the Pentagon Papers, I think there's lots of evidence to show that in 1965, as early as 1965 or maybe 66, in there somewhere, our leaders realized we can't win this war, and we have really misunderstood what's going on there. But they persisted in fighting that war, and a lot of it was because our leaders did not want to be the first president, whether it's LBJ or Nixon, to lose a war. So we have to persist in that, and that, if you had a brother or someone close to you who died in 1970 or 71, you would think, did this have to happen?
Mm-hmm, right. Now I know Johnson loaded it up. It's a poor choice of words, probably, but I know he really escalated it. Now, a little on the ironic side, didn't JFK start building that war up and started a little bit to send the troops
yes.
in? Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Yes, he did. And there, he started. I think he was starting to be sucked into all of this. we'll just send advisors, and then we'll just put air bases to defend ourselves. And then you think, well, we got to defend the air bases. So now we're expanding our operation to a 20-mile radius around the air bases. Well, now you're out in the jungle fighting. This all sort of like they talk about in many things, Project Creep. This was definitely, it kept getting bigger and bigger, and then LBJ started sending 50,000 troops in there and 3 different waves, and then all this bombing, and that was, boy, once you crossed that Rubicon, it was going to be very, very difficult to get out of there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now you were almost prime age. How did you serve in the military, or what happened with yourself?
I didn't. I had several friends who did, like I mentioned, but I was one of those who had, my first year in the draft was the year of the lottery.
Okay.
And the lottery is when they pick your birthday out, and it determined what order you would be drafted in. Excuse me, my number was 267.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a very high number, and so and I was in college at the time, so I just I never was called, but I certainly had friends and lost friends who were not only called but went there, and some of these stories I tell in the book that the characters are telling each other are true stories. And there's a story of someone we knew very well who they were meeting in Hawaii to get married, and he on his last patrol before he left for Hawaii, he was killed, and so his potential bride is waiting in Hawaii for him, and then she finds out that he was killed, and there's story after story like that.
It's just like profoundly sad,
Yeah, it is.
When you hear that, and you're talking to some of the, I would always think in war you're never the same when you come back. I mean, you can't be.
Yes.
And
yes.
You're talking like a loss of limbs, even if you survive the thing. I mean, I'm sure there's that whole thing, and that cost, which is probably mind-boggling too, along with all those 58,000 deaths or whatever the number. How many died? Would you remember? Am I correct?
58,000.
Okay, then I was correct. And how many were permanently injured or maimed? Do you know what that number is?
Oh, yeah.
Is it higher than that?
It's a higher number, and then of course the number of Vietnamese killed was much higher, and they.
How much was that number? What was that number, Greg?
That was like millions. That was
in the millions. Holy smokes.
Like 2.5 million or something like that. It was a huge number, and I think one of the things, I've read some things, Neil Sheehan, the great reporter for the New York Times who covered Vietnam for years, and other reporters who were over there, they would talk about how the way the United States kept score on the evening news was how many Americans were killed today and how many Viet Cong were killed today. And so, and keeping score that way, we were always winning. And that's because if they go in and bombed a city, a village, whatever, any Vietnamese person who was killed was often counted as enemy combatant who was killed, and that was not true.
Now, what was, for my viewers, that were, weren't even born, a lot of them before that war. What was the aftermath? Okay, eventually we get out. Like, what happened? Was there anything good out of it, or is it the same? Okay, the North still had their side. The South Vietnam was, like it was a total net loss, or was there any, like, what happened at the end of this whole thing?
Well, at the end, there's that famous picture of the helicopter on top of the embassy, and people are climbing ladders and climbing up on the roof, trying to scramble onto that last helicopter. And that's a really sad end to all of that. And I have read several accounts which said there were really good South Vietnamese people who had helped our troops, excuse me, and helped supported us through all those years, and we kind of abandoned them to the Viet Cong, and it's a very sad end, and it's one of those things where I think it ended badly. It could have ended badly in 1965 instead of 1972 or 3, and
right.
You would have got the same result.
And the North was I call it the enemy, right? I mean, the South was our side was the South. Okay. Now, what happens politically at the end of it? Okay, 2 million die from Vietnam, 58,000. Okay, that's terrible. Like, what happens at the end of it? Does the South just still control the South? The North, they're still the Viet Cong is still in charge of that. Does any of that change, or is it back to 1958 again?
It's back. Well, it's all controlled by a communist regime, and by the government out of the North, and it's a united country, and that was one of the problems, is that we thought we were fighting communism, and the Vietnamese thought they were fighting a civil war, North versus South, and that caused a great deal of misery, to say the least.
Yeah, a word comes to mind. You mind if I say it? Would that seem like?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's said a lot now, like a shit show. I mean, it's kind of what it sounds
Absolutely.
like. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely.
I keep my show PG rated, but that's just kind of what that whole thing sounds like. No disrespect to all the people that served, admirably and all that, but I mean, it's almost mind-boggling that whole thing happened, and with that kind of ending, where the communists are back in charge.
It is, and I know that some people will not like. There's people, and I talk about this in the book, and it's Alex Hurley's father, who's a career military guy. He had the view from an earlier time that when the United States military fights, the angels are on our side. It's the good guys and the bad guys, and we're always the good guys. Mm-hmm. And then, as that was one of the things that changed in the 60s, that they thought we weren't the good guys. And what's too bad is that there were men who did their duty and tried to do the right thing and be patriotic, and they came back from Vietnam, and they were treated very badly by the American public, and that's one of the tragedies of the war as well. Right.
I mean, it's probably another show down the road, but I mean, were you almost in shock after the Iraq war situation, the second one in 2001?
Yes.
Yeah, 2002. Yeah, like a repeat type of thing,
Yeah, it really does feel that way.
Yeah. What was one of the most profound things that I always remember, and it's kind of like, I don't know if it's peculiar to me or not, Greg, but when Kennedy was shot, in '68, and then you see the color. There's like a color footage of it, and then the busboy is holding his head, and then you see the blood coming out, and then you just know he's dead by the way it looked. He's just so still,
Yeah.
That is almost. I guess it just puts the reality to you right away when you see that. It's just. You can't even put it into words what that looks like and how that feels. Did you feel that undescribable feeling, the way that it looked when he died?
Oh yes, I did, and I remember, and when I've watched some of the news coverage of that, that's available on YouTube and other things, I remember thinking, well, maybe he'll be okay. Maybe, it was a small caliber. Maybe he'll be okay. It's not like JFK or Martin Luther King, where they were pretty much dead immediately. But, he was talking, and
he was talking.
Be okay.
He was talking right after he got shot?
He said a couple of things.
Okay.
One of the things he said was, is everyone okay? Which is a remarkable thing to say in those circumstances. And then the last words he said were to the ambulance drivers, and he said, "Please don't lift me." And I'm not sure why he said that, but the hard reality is, like you said, you see all that blood that the busboy is holding his head up, and there's all that blood everywhere, and you think that there's no way.
Right. Well, it's a little hindsight because I don't remember it live, so which must have made it much more harder, because now you're thinking, okay, he has a chance of living through this, and then the ultimate disappointment when that's not fulfilled and he dies. So it must have been crazily devastating, Yeah,
I think it's a little bit like, I thought one of the saddest things after 9/11 was you would see people wandering New York, downtown New York, with a picture of a relative and say, "Have you seen this person?" And it's like, that person is not living anymore, but this relative is trying to hang on a little bit longer to the idea that maybe they could be okay. And I think we do that because the truth of the reality is just too hard to face right away.
I got you. Okay. Greg, before I go into my hit and miss section, I want to just briefly your journalism career. Were you always a good writer? Did you always, even as a kid, want to get into this? Like at school, were you just a good writer? You just enjoyed it? Like just tell us how you got into that. I know you worked for some newspapers. Did you have this natural gift as a youngster?
Yeah, well, I like to think I have a natural gift. Whether I do or not is a matter for some.
Well, 11 books out. I think you do. So.
Yeah. but I'm never happier than when I'm writing, and I have loved writing these novels. When I did. I mentioned it as a little boy. If somebody stopped me and said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I would have said, "I want to be a newspaper reporter." And that's how I felt. And I would write like little kid newspapers and stuff. And then I would, when I was in high school, I was the sports editor of the high school paper, and I was involved in that. And I also did cover, was a stringer for the local hometown paper in the Bay Area. And then when I left college, I went to Wyoming because some jobs were available there, which was a real rough and tumble environment, but I got to cover politics there. And I mean, among the politicians I covered in that area in Wyoming was like Dick Cheney was there. I got to interview him a couple of times, but I covered, and then I became the news editor of the newspaper, yeah, I've always loved to do that, but I have surprised myself that I could, because of your newspaper background, that I could make the leap to fiction.
Right. Now,
Because it's one thing to report on the world you see, and it's another to make up a different world.
Right. And you always get the impression like it's just a tough way to make a living being a newspaper writer. I mean, is that right? Do you have to work your way up, and then maybe you write some books, and then is it a rough way to go? That way.
Yeah, I think it is, in the sense that I could. You try so hard to be accurate and be good, and you can say, wow, this morning's edition of the paper was really good. Well, nobody cares, because today's a different day, and now you have to, what have you done for me lately? So there is, it's pretty relentless, I guess.
And reading seems to be the cornerstone of wisdom and learning, isn't it? I mean, reading is what it should be, what it's all about. I guess there's experience,
yes.
And then how else do you learn stuff if you don't read?
Yeah, and I think and maybe this is an old person worrying about the rising generation or something, but I think it's concerning to me as I talk to some people about my book, and they say, "Oh, you're writing a new book? What's this book about?" And I tell them, and there is a lot of ignorance of history, even history this recent, and I think that's sad. That's a dangerous thing to not know history.
So you think the newer generations don't know the history like maybe the past generations, or appreciate it? They just live for today.
That's my impression from talking to people, and they don't, or younger people, and because I said something about this is about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and I had one person who was a really smart person said, "Oh, that's all the stuff that happened at Dallas." No, Robert Kennedy, not Jack Kennedy, and no, that's a whole different story. And some questions some comments I've heard like that are a little unsettling, I guess.
Like that person, it's almost, well, I don't know. It's just it doesn't shock me that people are like that, but maybe because I was at the tail end of the generation that wanted to know about history, that it's almost unimaginable for me someone not to know about Robert F. Kennedy or know that whole thing. Just
it is to me too, and about Vietnam and what it was like, and I get a little distressed about what we've evolved into, where the main populace is kind of disconnected from our war efforts, and we have a group of people who fight wars for us. And that, I don't think that's really desirable, but I also think, do you know what it was like for you to be plucked out of your life in college or whatever you were doing as a young person and then sent into the army and to Vietnam? That's a whole different situation than anyone
could relate to.
Now.
Yeah. Well, I was like I said, 8 and 68, and it was over your head. I mean, you're 8. You know there's this war going on. You just know there's this thing that seems like it's forever, and then you're like, hey, when I'm 17, I'm gonna probably go too, and it's a little fatalistic of a feeling. Like, I mean, it's in you as you're growing up.
Yeah, and when I was to be a teenager in 1968, there was real fear there that what I see happen to other people could certainly happen to me.
Right. And then, well, you must have felt pretty good when you got that high number. You know.
Yes, I did.
I would have, you know. But,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was being my paranoid self. I was like, do you think they read it earlier and I missed it or something? I
Right.
had to look in the newspaper the next day to make sure that really was the number, right? I wasn't like I missed it. You were actually number 12, but you missed it.
Right, right. You got to look at it like about several times to make sure, you know, that it
Yeah.
sinks in, you know. Uh, Greg, let me get into my hit and miss, which is my word association. This is how I really reveal my guest, you know. So this is, like I said, you know, the hard part. So are you up for this thing? You ready to go?
This could be scary. Yeah, go
Okay. Well,
ahead.
first thing that comes to mind are two. First, one or two things. Favorite color.
Blue.
Okay. If you were on a deserted island, what two musical CDs would you bring with you? You're going on this island for 5 years. You got two music CDs to bring.
Oh, I would probably bring the Beatles.
Okay.
Okay.
Any
'Cause I
particular
still
album
listen
or
to them.
just a greatest hits type thing?
I think probably the whole thing.
Do you remember when the Beatles were in San Francisco in '66? I mean,
Yes, I do. I do.
can you just tell me
And
that experience? You were at that prime age. I mean, you're 16. That's like,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, and well, and I kind of like the Beatles actually a little later on without all the screaming girls and everything, where you could actually, and the music really matured, I think.
Uh huh.
So
Right. The later year Beatles
yeah,
sound.
yeah.
Okay. Right. 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 The Okay. The Beatles. And what's the second CD? I don't recall what you just did. You say a second one? You got two. You got two CDs.
Yeah, well, I really love Bruce Springsteen, and he has
Okay.
a brand new album out that I think is wonderful, really cool.
I heard about that. Yeah, my wife's a huge
Yeah,
Springsteen fan. You know, he's from my area,
yeah,
by the way, from the Jersey
yeah.
Shore. Yeah, yeah,
That's right, and
yeah.
I can't go wrong saying that to a Jersey guy.
No, 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 no. He's kind of a hero around here, you know. So I met him a few times
Yeah.
just out. You know, he's a normal guy. Like, if you were in a foxhole, other than any family members, who would you be in? Who would you bring in there with you? Appropriate since we're talking about Vietnam in a way, but that's one of my usual questions.
Oh, I would probably be with. Um, I have a couple of friends who are real survivors and know how to do things in the outdoors. I'm sort of an indoor person, I guess, and so I need some guys who could help me survive in the outdoors.
Okay, so you got a couple in mind then, a couple of the outdoor type of guys. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
okay. Favorite movie?
Yeah. Well, I love Casablanca, and I love Chinatown, and I love. I really have trouble picking this because I'm a movie buff and really love lots of movies, but I think those two are extraordinary, and I've always well, I mentioned in the book the movie Bullet, which kind of captures that time.
Bullet.
And
Okay.
yeah, but I'm a big fan of the 30 Days of Oscars on TCM, that they always run all the Oscar winners, and I usually really fire up my DVR.
Are there any movies? Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Are there any movies from Vietnam, Platoon, or there's been several. Some were pretty good sellers. Anything that depicts it accurately? Any of those that you like, or what's your feeling on those?
Those are. There's some really sad, grim movies about Vietnam, but I think there was that one with John Boyd and Jane Fonda called Coming Home, and I think that really touched some of the themes you and I were talking about.
Oh, okay. Coming home. Okay. Okay. Favorite actor or actress?
Well, I think Cate Blanchett is just incredible in every movie she's in, and she seems to be a different person, and you forget that it's her, But I really like her a great deal, and I think I've always been interested in generally in Harrison Ford, what he does, and but I really like them a lot.
Okay, all right. If what was a budding journalist? What piece of advice would you give? What piece of advice did you give to someone that wanted to get into journalism?
Well, I think you sort of have to pay your dues. Like you said, it's sort of a hard thing to break into, and it really makes me terribly sad what has happened to the newspaper industry, and that it really is kind of dying. But thank goodness we have the New York Times, Washington Post, and others. But it's the small town dailies are really having a tough time. But I also think with newspaper writing, or whether it's writing of novels, there is no substitute for doing the work and learning your craft. And I always feel like with my books that when somebody says, hey, I wanted to read one of your books, where'd be a good place to start? I generally say read the last one I wrote, because I feel like the last one I wrote is the best one, because my writing was good. I felt like you hone your skills, I guess. And there is really no substitute for learning the craft by just writing.
Just plain old fashioned, just write.
Yeah, and I think I come out of it's a lot of work to write a novel, and you come out and of that experience, and you feel like you've learned a lot about how to do it.
Do you get sad when they're over? Like, do you miss these guys, these characters in there?
Yeah, you kind of do.
Like, do you miss Alex Hurley? Do you like, oh shoot, that's it for him?
Yeah, because I do, and I like that. And it's like I heard J.K. Rowling describe that as saying that you have this own private little world, and I usually write every day in the afternoon, and I come in and I go into this little world with these people I like, and have adventures with them, but at some point you have to. It can't be your private world anymore. You have to let it go and release your book and see what everybody else thinks about it.
Right.
And
so you gotta let the baby out in the world.
Yeah, I hope you like these people as much as I do, and so it's. You do miss them and do miss that experience.
Which do you have an author that you admire, that you inspired you? Ernest Hemingway, or any particular authors that you look up to?
Well, I really always loved Pat Conway, who was a writer from the South. I loved his, but I went to the Los Angeles Book Festival and met Michael Connelly, and that guy is just like, in Los Angeles, is just a total rock star. And I thought, this is like the coolest person on earth. He is, and I really like his books, and so I really like to read his books.
What book are you reading? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I have found that when you're writing a book, it helps to be reading a well-written book.
Okay. That makes sense. You know.
Yeah.
What book are you reading now? Do you have a book particularly you're reading now, or the last book you read?
I'm not reading a book right now. I've got a couple of piled up, but I've been so busy with the final production of this book, and it's interesting when you go through the editing and the galleys and the proofs and all these things. I really like my book. I really like the story, but I've read it now about 10 times, and you're like, all right, I'm ready.
I'll tell you, it's a great cover. I mean, I know, cover, kind of attracts me if you see a great cover.
Yeah.
However it came up with that was genius. That thing looks great,
Yeah, I'm really happy with that too.
Who was the most famous person you ever met?
Let's see. I got in an elevator in Portland, Oregon, and a Hilton, and Muhammad Ali was in there.
What year was this now?
This was
about.
Oh, it had to be in the 80s. And so
all right, so he's still like in the office prime a little. Okay.
Yeah. And I was just like, wow. And he turned his back and faced the wall as other people got on the elevator so they wouldn't recognize who he was. And he had a couple of guys there with him as security, but wow. And he was is an extraordinary person. And but I think that's I also got to interview a couple of people in my newspaper days, like Robert Redford, when it was a telephone interview, but it was when All the President's Men was coming out.
Okay.
The movie.
Uh-huh.
And Robert Redford, I think, he's another one of my very favorite actors. I'm interested in everything he does, and he's very intelligent and savvy. And
he has a great speaking voice on The River Runs Through It, that movie.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, if you had to meet an author or anybody tomorrow, I'm gonna grant this. You could anyone, Greg, in the world tomorrow. Who would it be?
Let's see. Boy, I would. Well, I like David McCallum a lot, who is writes great history books, and I like him. I like as far as authors are concerned, I think it's really interesting to talk to authors who have really made it, and to get their perspective on things. But it's
how about anybody in the world? If I said it could be an author, could be anybody. Anybody particularly you want to meet throughout history tomorrow?
Well, I think. Boy, you think of politicians and of growing up in the Bay Area, I'd like to spend a little time with Willie Mays.
Willie Mays, San Francisco Giants.
Yeah, and he was someone I admired from afar, and as a boy, and that would be like a New York person wanting to meet Mickey Mantle. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lot.
Well, I mean, he was, that was the prime years of his prime, right? In the probably early 60s,
Yes.
Did you go to Candlestick Park? Did you see games with Willie Mays playing?
Oh yeah. I did a lot, and that's some of my fondest memories as a boy.
That's cool because you were there right the prime age, right when they came into San Francisco in 58, and then yeah.
And I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to a person in the New York area, but I did not realize at the time we were happy. Wow, cool. We get the Giants and the Dodgers are going to LA and all this. But when I have since learned the history of all that. That is to have baseball leave New York is just such a sad thing. That it's when the Dodgers left Brooklyn and the Giants left New York. That's a very sad chapter.
The it's interesting from that perspective. The sad chapter of New York losing teams, you're getting them. And would you say Willie Mays was the greatest ball player ever?
I should think so. I think he's extraordinary, and it's also you think about the time in which he lived. You think of San Francisco as pretty advanced racially and all that, but I read things about Willie Mays in his biography where when the Giants moved to San Francisco, Willie Mays wanted to move from New York to San Francisco so he could be part of the city. And there were groups in San Francisco who said, we don't want some black guy moving in our neighborhood. And it's like, this is Willie Mays,
So was San Francisco sort of like Boston then, in that way?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. I never thought of it like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The couple more we're going to do, and then we'll be done. Appreciate this. This is interesting. Ocean. What comes to mind when you hear ocean?
The ocean?
Yes, ocean.
Oh, I'm a Pacific Ocean person. I've spent most of my life in California, Oregon, and Washington. So,
Pacific Ocean. Okay.
Yeah.
What was Dick Cheney like? I got to ask you that. I meant to ask you before.
Well, it's funny because at the time when I interviewed him and everything, I thought, what a nice man. I thought he was really nice.
Mm-hmm.
And he was nice to me. And wow, my opinion has changed. But, I always, it was interesting in those days that I would interview I have Malcolm Wallop and Alan Simpson, and there was a lot of really colorful politicians in Wyoming I got to interview, and they would walk in and they, hey, Greg, how you doing? And I was under no illusions. I wasn't like, wow, they remembered me. It's like, that his aide outside, he's saying to his aide, what is this schmuck's name? Greg. Oh, hey, Greg, great to see you again.
Right.
So I know there was that kind of stuff going on with covering politics, but it was very interesting.
Okay, yeah. He did seem to have a little change later. My wife used to like him a lot, and then
yeah. I did too, and wow.
Okay. All right, here's my last one. You ready? If you had one wish, Greg, in the world that would come true tomorrow, and I'm a genie, I'm gonna grant you a wish. What would your wish be?
What would I wish for?
Yes.
I wish we, I guess, just lived. I mean, this sounds like world peace or something, but I wish we just lived in a little bit gentler society where people were a little more kind to each other. And it sure seems that we have, in my lifetime, have become very harsh. And we're pretty hard on each other, and don't cut anybody any slack. And I guess it would be nice to live in a little bit kinder, simpler time. Like I think my parents' generation lived in a world like that, even though the 1950s left something to be desired, but people were a little more kind and gentle.
So the San Francisco in the 60s, I mean, you think of the peace and all that. I mean, that was real. I mean, you really felt like something was going on here in the world. There was a change going on.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of what I think the people who were protesting, the people who were trying to adapt new lifestyles, and then I think we thought, we really can change the world. We really could do it. And then it turned, then things like Robert Kennedy being killed, you think, well, maybe not.
I just had a question. I just lost my train of thought about that whole the music. It seems like, in my mind, the '60s music was the best. Do you think it was because of those times that brought out this emotion, this kind of music that was like, to me, it was just unbelievable, that music. We could always listen to it now, so I'm not saying we don't have it anymore. But what do you think of that?
Oh, I absolutely agree, and I think the music is incredible, and it really spoke to the times. But it was, I mean, you start saying, like, who is your favorite music from the '60s or '70s? That's really tough to.
There's so much.
Pick. Yeah, so much good stuff.
Did you go to Grateful Dead concerts?
I didn't go to any Grateful Dead concerts, but I went to Big Brother and the Holding Company in San Francisco when Janis Joplin was there.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. So, and then you would go to, if you went to Golden Gate Park in those days, they had a lot of love-ins and just bands would show up and start playing and things like that. So it's pretty great atmosphere for all that music.
Oh yeah. Janis Joplin. Wow, I would love to have seen her in concert. She let her soul loose. Wow. I mean, that's what a breath of life. The whole thing.
Yeah, it's like you see It's like you see Big Brother and the Holding Company, and then this is before they became famous, and you think, who is that woman? Wow.
Oh, before you knew that she was Janis Joplin, you just saw this woman out there. Yeah. And Greg, tell us how to, how you can buy your book. I guess it must be on Kindle and so forth, on your website, and then your next book you have coming out. Tell us about that too.
Okay. I've got a gregmessel.com website that has about all my books, and including this book. And then on Amazon, you can buy the book in either paperback or in ebook, so it'll work on your Kindle or your iPad or whatever. And so it's all out there and available. And
do you go to book signings and stuff at the bookstores? And
I have in the past, and I hope we will be having some in the future here with this book. And so we're working on. We're doing all the marketing and publicity now to get attention. It's not easy to do that,
right?
But that's what we're doing.
Okay, and what's coming next? What do you got? Like, you're writing currently, and then you got something coming out down the road.
Well, I haven't thought too far ahead, but I have a couple of ideas of what my next book would be. There was one I read, a journal that my grandmother kept, and she and my grandfather lived in a small mining town in the depths of the Depression, and there's some pretty fascinating stuff about what life was like then, and I'm interested in that, and I see how much of a story I can turn that into.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah, that would fascinate me too. You're right in my wheelhouse with all this stuff. Yeah. But Greg, I really appreciate you coming out. I really enjoyed this. And I did too. Thanks so much. Thanks for your time. Look forward to getting this book. I'm going to get it myself. And anyone that is interested in history or anything great, I guess, should get this thing. I mean, it's sad, but I mean, we should know about it, about that whole time frame. Right.
Yeah. Right.
That was Greg Messel. I am Ray K. And we'll catch you next time.